segment 4.9 on obtaining protection. I'm in the textbook on page 197, and this really focuses on making sure that your trademark stays active and alive during the period in which it is being used. Keep in mind that trademarks may last indefinitely. However, you still need to report back to the government that the mark is actually being used in order for that protection to be maintained and continued. First question that I have there is how much in advance of the deadline can you actually pay and maintain your mark? The second question is what happens if you pay your maintenance fee 1 day after the deadline? What happens if you pay your maintenance fee 6 months and 1 day after the deadline? So with respect to the first question, how much in advance can you actually do it? That's on page 198 mid-page, in which it discusses that you can pay it up to 1 year prior to the deadline. So, and when I talk about deadlines here, it is with respect to 6 years for the due date of the first maintenance document, 10 years for the second, 10 years for the third, and thereafter. So you know that after the first period of 6 years, that it's always 10 years that you need to file proof that that mark is continuing to being used. And you do not have to wait until the last day, obviously, to file this evidence. You can file it up to 1 year before the documents are due. Now, with respect to the deadlines are concerned, if you happen to pay 1 day after that deadline arises, well, all is not lost. In fact, if it is paid within the 6 months, as at the bottom of page 198, you can take advantage of a grace period. So there's a grace period even after that deadline, and you have essentially 6 months window of grace period, and there would also be some surcharge, obviously, with going into that period as well. If you pass that additional grace period of 6 months, then you would have to go back and re-register your mark with the trademark office. So let's look now into some slides associated with obtaining protection. First off, as simple as not a mark until the owner makes a bona fide lawful use of the mark in trade. So in other words, and this goes back to one of the fundamental concepts we discussed early on with respect to trademarks, namely you cannot receive protection for a mark if you have no intent on actually using the mark. So there needs to be some use associated with the mark in the marketplace, in the market, so that you can actually receive rights to it. And as the Lanham Act also clarifies, that this is not merely to reserve a right in a mark. So in other words, you get protection after showing that you're actually using it. Secondly, the owner of the mark is the person who controls the first use of the mark for the relevant goods or services. So again, it's the person who owns the mark who actually can control, first use of the mark. Next is a priority based on use. So the same mark cannot be used for the same type of goods or services. Keep in mind that when you file your trademark, you indicate the specific classes to which the mark actually relates to. And you cannot use the same type of goods or services in the same market by different sources, because the mark then doesn't serve as a source identifier. So in other words, the same mark cannot be used on multiple items in the same market if that mark obviously would be associated with more than one source. So if we have a brand of water and I call it Hayden Lake Springs, that mark cannot be used for, let's say, within the beverage industry. If I have one for water and I have one for soda pop, if those both are two different companies, both using the same name, Hayden Lake Springs, then that would cause confusion, obviously, in the eyes of the consumer. That wouldn't be allowed. So that simply goes back to the fundamental item that we looked at, namely that you want to minimize confusion within the marketplace. Now, priority based on use is an interesting aspect, because let's assume that two people have a mark and they are both applying for protection of the mark. And both of them are, for purposes of our discussion, in two different areas of the country. Well, to a certain extent, under that type of approach, if both of their geographic limitation, and that gets to the next point as well. If both of the geographical limitation is limited to a very specific area, they could receive marks for the same goods and services, but it's confined to the geographic area in which they are located. If you contrast that with, let's assume that, for example, you have a mark for beef jerky within, let's say, Pittsburgh, and everybody knows the Mary's Beef Jerky within Pittsburgh is a very known thing. But then somebody else comes along and starts selling also beef jerky under the name Mary's Beef Jerky, but it's a nationwide website type offering where it's offered in all 50 states. The question is, who gets rights to Mary's Beef Jerky? And the answer is, and for purposes of our discussion, let's assume that they both entered the market at the same exact time. And what the trademark office would look, again, is at what's the likelihood of confusion. If, for example, if we are in Texas and somebody says Mary's Beef Jerky, if everyone is thinking of the online website where Mary's Jerky is sold, then that would be a valid type association between having a specific good and a specific source. If you contrast that with if you were in Pittsburgh and somebody says Mary's Beef Jerky, if everyone in Pittsburgh thinks of the actual shop of Mary's Beef Jerky and not the website seller, then under that type of situation, it would make sense that the location in Pittsburgh of Mary's Beef Jerky should receive protection as well. And the answer is they would both receive protection, with the caveat that the Pittsburgh-based Mary's Beef Jerky would receive protection only for the geographic area in which they are located there in Pittsburgh. And when you think about the online presence of the Mary's Beef Jerky, they could receive protection throughout the rest of the national United States, with the exception of Pittsburgh, because that is the carve out where this other location is actually found. You can also have priority just based off of use of when it is that you actually started using this. So if you have two companies, again, Mary's Beef Jerky, and they are both entering the same geographic area, selling the same exact thing, same exact good, with the same exact name, but two different sources, the person that actually entered the market first would have priority to actually receive protection for the mark first. So when you actually have a bona fide use in the market, that actually serves to also show that you actually, that is the date in which you can rely on for protection within the market. With respect to geographic limitations, one of the examples that I learned when I was in law school was when I was over in Europe, and we were looking at comparative law, comparing and contrasting the US-based system to the European system as well. And one of the things that they said there was they had everyone raise their hand. Do you know what Budweiser beer is? And everybody in the class raised their hand and they said, well, in Europe, it is not the Budweiser that you know in the States. And everybody was a little perplexed, and then they showed an image similar to what you see here on the right-hand side. And this is a Romanian-based beer manufacturer by the name of Budweiser. And the one on the left-hand side is the American-based beer manufacturer with the name of Budweiser. And what we have here is a classic example of geographic limitation. So each of these obviously are applying for rights within their own countries, but those rights are also constrained to where it is that they are located. So on the right-hand side, actually, I guess it's not from Romania, it's from the Czech Republic. And so they would have constraints as far as where it is they can distribute their beer, where it is that they can actually market and sell their beer within the confines probably of Europe. On the left-hand side, America-based Budweiser would have confines of actually distributing, manufacturing, and marketing just within the American market as well. Now, with respect to loss of protection, this is similar to when we're looking at genericide before, that would be an obvious loss of protection going on. Let's look at sometimes whether there's an intentional abandonment or potentially an unintentional abandonment as well. So a trademark may be abandoned if, one, the owner discontinues use of the mark. Now that would make sense because, again, the trademark may last indefinitely. But if you stop using it and you stop registering it, similar to what we read in the book, you may lose rights to it. So that would be the first most obvious way of actually losing protection. The second would become if the mark actually becomes generic, consistent with the discussions that we've had. The third was whether the mark otherwise loses its significance as a mark. Now you would say, well, isn't that kind of generic? No, generic is when the mark is now associated with the genus rather than a specific source. And you contrast that with if the mark loses its significance as a mark. Let's say that you had a product line that was called Punix, and Punix was for a specific camera line. And when they started to do it, they were building up this camera line, and they were really doing it. It was the glamour child, poster child of the campaign of the manufacturer. But then over time, Punix started occupying less and less of the market share to such an extent where it was not being used. It was being used, but not as much as it was before. And not only that, but it was no longer as significant of a mark. So this would be a little bit more of a subjective type analysis, because to a certain extent, the question that they would ask is there a bona fide attempt to actually use the mark? If there's a bona fide attempt, then that may overcome this potential argument that it has otherwise lost its significance. But just keep in mind that it's important to continue to use your mark, even if you want to continue to maintain rights to it. And the key inquiry with all this is whether or not there was actually an intent to abandon. With respect to generic, you may definitely make every appearance and every intent to not abandon it from the point of view of actually causing your mark to become generic. But nonetheless, it's not necessarily looked at from the point of view of the owner of the mark, whether or not they take sufficient steps. The question that they're asking is whether or not in the mind of the general public, whether or not that mark has actually become generic. That's a little bit different than the first and second categories for loss of protection, namely because if the owner discontinues, if they intend to really discontinue, then that's a very kind of blatant act. But the last one, whether or not there was a loss of significance of the mark, they're looking much more at the intent of the owner there, whether or not they intended it to lose its significance or whether they actually are making a bona fide attempt to continue to use it.